Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie. I'm a book-loving, notebook-hoarding reader and writer on a mission to change lives one book and one notebook at a time. And this is the Get Literate podcast. On this podcast, we explore the power of leading literate lives. We talk all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to make our lives better. And no matter what better means to you, the pages inside books and notebooks can help us get there. So, each week, we'll mix together books, notebooks, mindful practices, and creativity to cultivate a life we love. Now, grab a notebook and your TBR list, and let's get literate. Hey everyone, Stephanie here, welcoming you back to another episode of the Get Literate podcast. I am here with a quick introduction to the episode and today's guest. Today, I am talking with Cara Infante of the Bookish Flights podcast. We initially connected around our shared love of books, and not just our shared love of books, but our shared love of 3 books paired together. You know that when I recommend books here on the podcast, I typically recommend those books in trios, and Cara does the same on hers, calling them Bookish Flights. So today we got together to talk about books that are set in the Midwest, a location that Cara has lots of experience with. Ideally, it was to help me broaden my own reading life and to experience a location I had never been before. But as always, in our conversations, we end up realizing the true power of books like this. Books can be tools to take us places, but they can also be tools to prepare us to move to those places. Now, I won't give much more away before Cara can explain, but listen in, because you're not only going to hear the 3 books that Cara recommends, but you're going to hear us talk about the bookish themes that emerge from them and how those bookish themes actually parallel the themes that are important to us in our own life. And at the end, we're going to add even more books to your TBR based on what Cara is currently reading, which gives me a few to add to my TBR and specifically my audiobook playlist too. So let's get to it. Cara, welcome to the Get Literate podcast. I'm so excited to chat books with you today as a fellow podcaster, and I almost think like a podcast twin with the ways we recommend books. So welcome. So glad to have you here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's really a pleasure to be on the other side of the mic. It gives me a little bit of, insight into how my guests feel being on the other end.
Yeah, I know it's nerve-wracking both ways, I think, but it is very different.
Yes, yeah, the preparation was quite different for today, but in a good way.
Yeah. Well, to give listeners just a little bit of background, we first met in air quotes, on a Facebook group of other podcasters. It's kind of a group where you can go, you can ask questions, you can meet people. And the one thing that I loved about connecting with you is that when I read your response and when I went to your podcast, I thought, oh my goodness, this person is like me on the other side of the country doing something similar, at least for my reading episodes. I do talk about reading and writing. And when you talk about reading, like when I talk about reading, you love to recommend sets of books on a particular theme, as I do. I love to recommend books based on growing what we go through and all sorts of topics. And you recommend 3 books, and you have a wonderful guest come on and just kind of broaden everybody's reading lives with these really cool book flights. So I don't want to steal your thunder anymore, but I would love for you to introduce yourself to readers and tell them a little bit more about you and your podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And I remember meeting when we first met too, thinking like we're kindred spirits for sure. But yeah, I'm Cara. I am actually a military spouse. I am a mom of 3, and I'm actually a physical therapist by trade. So I didn't start out as in the world of books as professionally trained, let's say that, because I have been a reader my entire life. except for when I was in college and grad school, and I had to like basically say I could not even pick up a leisure book because I will want to read that and I won't want to study. So I would have to like cut myself off.
Yeah,
Um,
I can relate.
and so I remember actually, funny story, going to a Barnes and Nobles. I think it was a Christmas break during grad school. And I went to the store, and it was like the first time I was able to be around books in 6 months, right? Because the semester had finished. And I was in there for probably an hour and a half. And the same sales clerk kept coming up to me. He's like, "Ma'am, are you okay? Can I help you find something?" And I was like, it's just the simple fact that I get to choose any book I want right now.
Yes.
So I think he thought I was a little bit crazy, but that's okay. It was just the simple fact of not someone telling me what to read, but me getting to choose my next adventure. And that was exciting in itself.
Oh, I love that. Choose your own next adventure.
Yeah. And but yeah, so right now we live in San Diego. We tend to move about every 3 years, so we're in our first year of living here. And so we're learning it, and that's actually one reason why I love reading, and kind of the book flight we went with today is traveling through the pages a little bit, is I love being able to then read about the area that we're moving or the area that I'm now living in, right? Whether it's culture or food or geographical location, the history of the area. And so that is really, since we've started moving with the military, it's one way I've really explored books or tried to pick up books in my life is to the current geographical location that we're living at to just learn more. Because I think, I think we all feel that, right? If we go on vacation for a long weekend, you're really just getting a taste of what that place is like. Even sometimes if you're only there a year and a half, you're getting some, but like by the time you finally get settled from moving and figuring out your way around, you're not getting much time to experience it and really take it in. So um, I really use books to help me do that and find areas maybe I would want to explore more or learn about more in that location.
I love that. I also love reading books with a really strong sense of place so that
Yeah.
we can do what you said, which is just travel through the pages of the book. But I never quite thought of it in the way that you just said, which is almost preparing you for this big life move, a big life transition to really kind of get your feet wet in that location without ever actually going there first, almost like this runway to help you with that big move. I love that. Do you do that with the kids too? Do they kind of open up to an area with, say, picture books or middle grade literature, or is this something that is just still mainly you?
I think what I try to do with the kids is the past few places we've lived, we'll go find like an indie local bookstore and we'll buy a couple picture books that will help them remember. So I'm almost doing it on the back end with my kids of like when we leave, then we'll be able to talk about the animals or the history or, read those books again and again. And in my mind, I'm hoping that they won't forget these places that we've lived.
Right. Oh, I love that. So, and with the kids, it's memory keeping in the books.
Yes.
With you, it's preparing, right? To see
Yeah.
them probably too in these different moves.
Yeah. And I think that I have a tendency, I don't want to say I'm not a nervous person by any means, but I think when I feel like I'm researching and planning, it gives me a sense of I have not control, but that I'm doing something positive
Yes.
that's going to help our move. And I think that the military, and it could potentially feel like we are being dragged around, right? Like you're
Mhm.
often told like it's the needs of the Navy, right? Like you're just the next place you're going is the needs of the Navy, right? And you're not having much say in that. But I think for me, when I'm able to, again, travel through the pages, learn more, get excited about the area that we're living, I almost feel like I'm taking control and, almost like a personal accountability to where we're going to be moving. Like I'm really going to jump in and enjoy this for what it is.
Yeah. Gretchen Rubin, who is one of my all-time favorite people in the world, says often that action is the antidote to anxiety. And
There you
it
go.
sounds like reading books, set in those places is your action to really make that process go smoothly.
Yeah. Yeah. And my husband, right? Like we obviously moved for his job. And so I always say, like, he gets to walk in to a community right away. He gets to walk into a job right away. And when you're on the outside of the military, again, I mean, you're like the spouse, but when you're on the outside and you're not having a job to walk into or an automatic community, you have to work a little bit harder. And I think for me, just knowing to get my feet on the ground and I want to go explore these things, it does take away from or help me maybe make a community in these things we're trying to do.
Yeah. Oh, I think, too, also, because when I think again of a strong sense of place books, I think, okay, I'm going to escape, or if it's my area, then I get to experience it a bit more. And now this really does open it up for using books as tools in yet another way.
Yeah.
And because you have the podcast too, where you're and this is me speculating and leading to a question. You're talking to different people every week about 3 books that are important or related to them in some way. It sounds like you're making your own community wherever you go, because you can take that with you through books, which is just a whole nother special layer on top of it.
Yeah. And this will be the first time I've had that. So part of why I started the podcast was we had moved to Sicily. This was, I don't know, 2017. So what is that? Math
Who
early
knows?
this morning, 6 years ago, right? And we knew moving to Sicily that I was going to be going to a stay-at-home mom type role, right? Like we didn't, my husband is a physical therapist too, so we knew he probably wouldn't be able to be my boss. So I was just going to be home with the kids. And so I was ready for that step in my life. Our kids were really young. And so it was the perfect time to do it and to get this time with them. But I'd always told myself when we were going to move back, I would just go back to the physical therapy clinic, right? Like just like everything in life, right? You think you're going to do these things. And I'm slowly but surely realizing I cannot plan my life out because it has so different from what I thought it'd be like 18, 25-year-old, person, totally different now. But then we moved back to the States in June of 2020 and physical therapy clinics weren't really open. And yeah, so I was like, well, okay. So, and we knew we were moving. We moved 3 summers in a row starting in 2020. So the other part of that was, I don't know that I really want to get a job anyways. By the time I finally find a job, get into the clinic, and I do a specialty of physical therapy. So by the time I recruit physicians to refer to me, we're going to be moving again.
Right.
And it just kind of felt like a hamster wheel, right? And my kids were young. Only one was school age. The other 2 were still at home with me. And it just came down to, I don't know that this is really still going to work in our life. Even though I thought it would in 2017, I thought I would be going right back. And so, but I was realizing what I was missing was a creative outlet. And for those of you that maybe are a stay-at-home parent, right, was that adult interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I missed being in the physical therapy clinic and learning people's stories. And so that's how I got on this idea for the podcast was, well, first off, I got to thinking, what do people call me about? And I'm like, well, usually like an injury clinic. They'll call me like, hey, I hurt my knee. What should I do for it? But the other thing people would call me for was books because they knew that that was an active part of my life. And I've really always had that be an active part of my life. And so I was like, I think I could take a podcast so much farther with books, right? We could go into so many different topics. And I'm realizing now in interviewing a guest in each episode, I'm getting to hear their story a little bit, which was what I really missed from my physical therapy days was getting to know people and getting to hear their story. And in, like you had mentioned in the show, it's a book flight of books. So think of it as like a wine flight or a beer flight of books. It's going to give you 3 books to sample and savor new topics, new genres. And so that was I thought I could take that so much farther with ideas and show episodes and all of that. And so that's how Bookish Flights came about.
I love learning the backstory of everything. I love knowing why authors decide to write. I love knowing why people became, the kind of people that they are. I love that backstory because it seems like it might be a drastic change, right? Physical therapist to bookish podcast host. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It's
No.
the theme of what you loved about that job. And now it just kind of manifested into something else, which is
Yeah.
great. And without that, we wouldn't be meeting talking about books. It's so
Absolutely. Yeah,
fun.
it's a
It's
whole
so
new
exciting.
community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's exciting. Okay,
And I
well,
think too, really quick, one other thing
yeah.
is usually when guests come on, they pick, well, always guests will pick their book flight, but I think it usually comes down to books you love, right? Some of your favorites. And I think that we can learn so much about people by their favorite books.
Yes. Yes. Oh, I wish I was good at remembering quotes and memes that I see on social media. But yesterday I saw one, that said, like, it was kind of the reverse of recommending books to people of like, show me your favorite book and I'll tell you who you are. Kind of- yeah, that's a pretty neat thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I love it from that perspective of getting people's stories, but also I think you hear a bit of their story through their favorite books as well.
Yeah. And so today, speaking of books, because of
Yeah.
course that's why we are here, you are here to share a book flight with us that are kind of embodying books from the Midwest, right? So we've got strong sense of place. We have, books that either can feel like home, if that's your neck of the woods, or books that can feel like an escape, or books that, as you mentioned earlier, just help us experience somewhere different. Maybe that we've been, maybe that we haven't been. And so I'm really excited for this because I have a feeling these books are going to be new for me, knowing about my own reading life and what I tend to kind of lean into. So I'm excited. How did you pick just three books in this
This
particular
is,
topic?
I feel like this is such a hard thing to do. My husband interviewed me on an episode earlier on in the show. So I put myself in the hot seat like I'm doing today. And what I have found is it is so easy to find two books that pair well together. But finding a third book to fit the pairing is really quite a challenge. And so I have added on my show where people can offer a dessert pairing if they like, or if they don't offer a dessert pairing and I've read that genre, sometimes I'll offer them a recommendation too as like a thank you for coming on the show. But that gives us a little more flexibility that we could potentially talk about four books on the show versus three. But the reason why I chose these books, because there are so many books set in the Midwest when I actually got down to really making sure I had a good list to bring to your show today. But I grew up in, I say Chicago, but it was a really small town in northwestern Illinois. And so a lot of the books I ended up choosing are more this rural Midwest vibe, which if you've ever driven through the Midwest, you know that that is pretty common, right? Like you drive through miles and miles of flat green cornfields. Like that is, I mean, at least in Illinois. And so there are plenty of books set in the city of Chicago. There are plenty of books that are the more this urban environment, which not to say that those aren't great books, but that is not the experience that I have had growing up in the Midwest. And so I chose these books. And when I realized it, when I sat down to kind of prepare these and really make sure I remembered them well, is two of the books actually include recipes from the food that they
Oh,
talk about in these books. One does not, but it also still talks about food. And so I love food. I think food, again, sampling in these different regional areas that we have lived in has been so fun to try. And I think it tells you a lot about your culture. And maybe that was part of my upbringing too, right? Was just so and so is going to bring in her potato salad, right? Like, and she's got the best recipe around. Like, I think that there's so much nostalgia in that. And so I think that's why I have gravitated towards these three books.
but you didn't set out to do it that way, right? It just kind of happened. You're in the reflection. That's what you.
100%. Yeah, when I was thinking about the books in the Midwest that I have read, and again, I've by no means read all of them. So there could be a lot of others out there, but these were some of my favorites that stuck out in my mind that truly give you this sense of that Midwest experience.
I love the act of reflecting on the stack as well. Like you said, it's one thing to pick the books. You can try to pair them in one way or narrow them down or make sure they all fit. But what happens in the thinking, right? Of, okay, why this book? Why this one? How does it match this one? That's when you go deeper
Yeah.
into what the books represent, what the themes mean to you and your reading life, what it could offer the people you recommend. So I love that you kind of stumbled across that reflection and thinking about that. And that we get to bring a little bit of it today. I am a terrible cook. I do have lots of wonderful memories around food. I don't know how good I am at recreating them for the others around me. So I think this is a pairing that I definitely I could benefit from.
Yeah, and one thing I've always done with reading with our moving a lot is we're packing up our entire house every 3 years, right? And so I don't often keep a lot of hard copy books around the house, especially if I have always read them. So one thing I've always done when I've been reading is think about who I can give this book to next because I want to gift it to someone. And so I think I've always kind of thought about, and that's why I love asking people what they're reading because, right, it gives me insight to who they are. And hey, you might get a little book mail on your doorstep from me when I'm done reading this book.
I love that. Book mail is the best mail.
Yes, but I think it's made me think about it a little bit deeper about, like you said, maybe the themes or the main characters and their tendencies and who they are and who that, because I'm always, as I'm reading, I'm trying to match this up with who is going to be gifted this book later.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a fun
So,
process. I love that process.
yeah, it
Well,
really is.
so let's dive in then. What is the first book? And
Okay,
I should ask first, are these in like top 1, 2, 3 order, or are these in no
they're
particular?
not.
Okay.
I
All right.
think I would be hard pressed to tease out a favorite out of these because I think they all actually two are by the same author, but I think the storylines are so different.
Okay.
And so I thought it was enough variety. Because I do have some other favorite Midwest authors, like I said, but some of them are a lot heavier of books, a more like emotionally invested read. And I wanted to keep this light and books that will bring you joy, almost like heartwarming type stories, that cozy story.
Oh,
And I
yes.
think
I love the hug books.
yeah, so all three of these I think will capture that. So that's why I tried to stick to this. And again, there's plenty of other great books about the Midwest, but I wanted to keep this light, heartwarming, and cozy.
Perfect for summer reading. I love it.
Yes. Okay, so the first book I am bringing is called Kitchens of the Great Midwest, and it's by J. Ryan Strawdall. And this was actually his debut novel. Have you heard of this one?
No, brand new for me.
Okay, so it starts out with the Thorvald family, and they live in Minnesota. And it's a husband named Lars, it's his wife, Cynthia, and Eva is their daughter. And Lars is a chef. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Cynthia is too, but Cynthia really starts getting into wanting to become like a sommelier and loving wine. And well, unfortunately, she ends up falling in love with a dashing sommelier that's teaching her the ropes. And she leaves her family early on. So her infant daughter and her husband. And so the story really focuses on this whole family unit. But what is unique about this book is each chapter is from a different character's perspective, but they all are telling the story of Eva, who's the daughter. So every chapter, you're getting a different perspective, whether it's from Lars, her dad, whether it's from a boyfriend, whether it's from someone she's worked with, whether it's from a best friend, but they're all in chronological order, are telling the story of Eva's life, but you're never truly getting that Eva's perspective until the very end. And each chapter highlights a different food dish. And so these are where the recipes come in. So because this is like a whole family of chefs, right? It starts out with the first chapter is about Lars, and he's starting to raise this infant daughter, and he's going to the pediatrician, and I think she's like 3 months old, and he's like, can she have pureed pork shoulder? Can she have pureed carrots cooked with all of these things? And the pediatrician's looking at him like he has a third eye, like, how about just like avocado? But he's a chef and he really wants to share his love of food with his daughter. And so as the story progresses, it's Eva growing up, and she actually starts to get into the food industry herself. No surprise, right, with this kind of upbringing that was on her. And she's really starting to find like a salvation almost and solace in food, because she hasn't had the easiest life, right? With her mom leaving, abandoning the family essentially at an early age. And there's some funny stories of like a chili eating contest that I remember. There's a big Scandinavian influence in Minnesota. And so there's like this lutefisk, which I've never actually had myself because that was not where I grew up. But you learn about all these different foods locally. And if there's anything that you know about the Midwest, people are really almost stuck in their roots. I hate to say it, but we know what we know, right? And like you're not going to change much because you know what you know, and that's your comfort zone. And so as Eva starts getting older, she is getting more and more into this foodie type scene. And so it's this fun play between like Minnesota roots and Minnesota culture and, not wanting to change versus this like you know, bringing of like the foodie culture and the rise of this like higher up type thing and this like clash almost between Minnesota culture and foodie culture, which kind of are very opposites. And so it's really fun to kind of see the dynamics at play there.
Sounds fascinating. I love the whole structure, the format
Yeah,
because I love books that alternate between characters, but in a typical alternating format, you learn more about the character who's actually narrating that chapter. And here they just
correct.
flipped the script a little bit. And now we're getting more about this one character, which I don't think I've ever read a book like that, or at least not one that's coming to top of mind right now. So that's fascinating just for that, let alone being able to really dive in to the culture of not just the location, but it sounds like food too, which
Yeah.
is another added bonus there.
Yeah,
Oh,
and I think the descriptors, right, of the location, I feel like it was like a play of the senses almost, right? Like you're getting these beautiful visual pictures of the Midwest, but then you're also getting all these like smells and nuances of the food. And so I loved it because again, it just felt like this feast of the senses as you're reading it, all while telling a story from a perspective that like you said, I've never read a book with a structure like that.
yeah. This may have to go to the top of my, at least for now, right? The first book is at the top. We'll see what your second and third recommendations are, but this one is definitely sounds intriguing that I would love the format, I think.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, I read this book as an audiobook. And so I didn't find it too confusing with the alternating timelines, right? Because it's sometimes with audiobooks and alternating timelines, I'm like, "Oh, I think I need to read this on the page." But once I got the understanding of how that book was structured, where it was just a different character telling all about Eva, right? And the main part was Eva, it really was not confusing as audio. I really enjoyed it as
Oh,
the audiobook. So
oh, oh, I love it. Okay. Book two.
awesome. And so we'll switch gears a little bit with book two. This is a memoir and it's called Burnt Toast Makes You Sing Good, which the title alone.
Title.
And it's by Kathleen Flynn. And this book will take us to Michigan. And
Oh,
so
love traveling to Michigan through books. Oh, big Viola Shipman fan here. I'm so excited now. Okay.
yeah. So this book also happens to include recipes. And this book is about the early life of Kathleen. She's written another book, but this one's set on her early years. And I will say it's not all set in Michigan because they do move to San Francisco in her childhood. But I think you get enough of the sense of the Midwest, and they take all of their food culture from Michigan to San Francisco and open a pizza parlor. So you're still getting a lot of the Midwest, even though a part of the book is in San Francisco. Um, but what I loved about this book is Kathleen just had this like iconic Midwest childhood, right? Like everything that I think of my childhood, and I think she's a little bit older than I am, but everything she was talking about in her childhood just resonated with me so much. And again, it struck that chord of nostalgia with me a little bit. And this was the book with like the memorable home cooks and who had the best pizza recipe and who had the best fried chicken recipe and who had the best pasta sauce recipe, right? And I like remember I'm from an Italian family on my mom's side. So this is something, and you can see me talking with my hand over here. That's something I think I picked up in Sicily. But that was just such a part. Food brought people together, right? And that was a main vein of everybody coming together and enjoying these dishes. And so what she does, it's not set up via chapter, but she does provide some of the recipes that she talks about in this book. But it talks about their early life, and was from a poorer family, so they didn't have a lot of resources. And so it's not always easy, right? And I think what I loved about this book was just showing that it wasn't always easy, but that family was always there, right? Family, food, and love. Like that was all you needed, right? You don't need the fancy car, you don't need the fancy this, just being together. And so I really loved that sense of family that came through in the book. But as they go, like I said, they move to San Francisco and they start a pizza parlor. And they take Uncle Clarence's popular oven fried chicken, and it's a pizza parlor, but this oven fried chicken becomes like what people come to this pizza parlor for, which is just after a while that's dawning on them is like, people come for the chicken, but we're a pizza parlor. Like maybe this is our advertising is, marketing is not going as well. But they talk about, Grandpa Charles was this former army cook, and they still use his chili recipe at this pizza parlor. And so it's like they almost hodgepodge these famous family recipes that they had. I remember like the grandma's famous Swedish pancakes, and they take all these and then they just put it into the pizza parlor, and it just becomes a smorgasbord of Midwest eating.
In disguise as a pizza parlor.
Correct. And again, back to kind of like Midwest culture in general. I can only speak to Chicago because this is what I know, but people are very passionate about the best pizza place, the only true toppings that you can add to a hot dog to eat to make it an actual hot dog. And people will like fiercely defend their choices in where to get the best deep dish pizza in Chicago. And I know tomorrow, if I am on the street and I meet someone from Chicago, I can be like, where's your favorite pizza place? And it can become this hotly debated topic with someone I literally just met, because that is, how it is there. And I don't know if it is like that in other parts of the world, because I think I just not growing up there, I didn't know enough to like get in this hot topic about where do you find the best of this. But that's something that to me seems very Chicagoan.
Yeah. Well, I live in New York. I'm
Okay.
closer to Canada than I am New York City, so I'm not a city girl at all. But I imagine if we were to ask some New Yorkers their favorite pizza places, their favorite cheesecake places, or we go to Philly and we get the cheesesteak, it's definitely something I think that while they may be talking about a particular area in this book, many people, I imagine, can relate to that question and that emotion, that comes with food and book recommendations. And so this one sounds wonderful too.
Yeah. And now that I'm worth talking about that, I remember when we were living in Sicily, and granted there was some language barrier, right? Because I was only really like minor conversational Italian. But I remember people being like, this town is known for chocolate. This town is known for almonds. And when we like harvest these things essentially to make these dishes, we're going to this, Modica for chocolate, or we're going to Noto for the almonds, right? And so they had it almost too. Now, again, I can't tell you because of my limited Italian if it was really like a hotly debated topic, but I do remember that as well living there. So it must be worldwide. I just don't know enough of it when we moved somewhere for such a short time.
Well, and now I'm hungry. Chocolate and almonds, and those are two of my favorite things together. So put it on the bucket list.
There you go. And I'll give you a full itinerary. I'll give you a flight itinerary to go. So
That's right. You can give me a book flight so I can learn about the area, and then I can go jump in and enjoy the culture and the food.
And don't eat for a week before you go. So you'll be perfect.
All right. So what do you have for our third book to round out these two great selections?
Okay, so now we're going to J. Ryan Strawdall again,
Mhm.
and we're actually going back to Minnesota, but we're taking a twist. We're leaving food. And this one's called the Lager Queen of Minnesota. And so we're going to beer, which again, I'm not a big beer drinker, honestly, but this is like a hotly debated topic about best breweries and all of this, and it's a very Midwest thing here. And so this book by him I thought was so different. It's more your traditional storyline, but it focuses again on family, right? I think there's a going theme of that as well. Um, but it's two sisters, Helen and Edith. And really, the story revolves around them. And early on in the book, their father passes away, and he had a farm and this large family inheritance. And Helen happens to be the younger sister, and Edith is the older sister. And it was supposed to be split evenly between the two of them. But the entire inheritance ends up going to the younger sister, Helen. And so early on in the book, you're learning this. And this causes quite the rift between the sisters, as you can imagine. And where the book is taking place, I don't remember how many years later this is, but they have not spoken in many years because of this instance. And so the story starts where I think it starts with Edith. You start to learn about Edith. And Edith has been married to Stanley for 40 years and works in a nursing home. And remember, this is the one that didn't receive the inheritance. So as you're learning about her, almost everything comes down to, well, what if I would have received just some of the money? Because they're like barely making ends meet, and they're definitely a poor family. Um, and so it's this question all along of, well, what if I would have had some money along the way to help me out? But what happens is there's a bake off, and Edith has been known for making her pies. And Edith decides to enter this bake off, and she wins this bake off. And so this kind of starts to take Edith down a different path of, well, what if I maybe leave this menial job at a nursing home? Not that it's not rewarding, but a menial paying job, and maybe try to make something of myself with pies. But then I don't want to tell that. I don't want to spoil that part of it.
Okay, good.
She's had a tough life, and she's even raising her granddaughter, and her granddaughter starts to get really rebellious. And there's just, you can tell she's a hardworking woman. She's resilient. And I really loved her as a main character because she just was such a strong, no matter what came at her in life and knocked her down, she was so, I don't know if maybe strong is not the right word because I don't think she's portrayed as strong, but how resilient she was strikes me as strong.
Mhm.
So then it kind of flips over to Helen. And Helen has taken her inheritance and she has made this beer company. And it has been a highly successful beer company. They've even sloganed, drink lots, it's Blots, because it's Blots beer and it's this well known beer around the country. Well, something happens with Helen where she's not able to put out the same amount of work she was doing, and she finds herself in need of help, which she really has no one to turn to. And it's like, okay, is she going to do this? Is she going to? And Diana has now, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't say Diana is the granddaughter. Diana has been starting to go into the beer business with Aunt Helen. And she's trying to do the IPA side of things and try to update the beer company a little bit. And she's kind of pushing towards like, well, why don't we ask Edith for some help? And Helen's very resistant because Helen's kind of, she's a strong personality. And so it really becomes, is she going to ask Edith for help or not? And this evolution of the story, and there's so much transformation of Edith, I think. And I really, I don't know that I identified with Edith, but she really struck me as a character. It was warm. It was like quintessentially Midwest in the descriptions and the beer. And this book doesn't so much talk about food, but just in the farm life and the family dynamics. And I loved it. It was really good.
It sounds good. I love a good family saga story.
Yes, it
And I
definitely is that.
really, yeah, I really also love books where the character does go through some sort of transformation and we get this kind of full circle-y kind of effect at the end. And I know you're not revealing what's happening, but I'm eager now to figure out what exactly happens with both of those things. And it sounds like there's a little bit of food. There's some pie.
There is. There's some pie.
Oh,
There's some beer. Again, I'm not a beer drinker and I still really enjoyed this book. So I think that there is definitely, because again, like you said, there's the family saga and the transformation story, and mostly it's women main characters in the book as well.
oh, it sounds wonderful. I think I'm still putting Kitchens of the Great Midwest first. I need to experience that structure. But
Yeah,
I
I would
think
love to
this
hear what
one,
you think when you
yeah.
finish.
Oh, I will definitely let you know. But I think this one might have to go second because of the family saga and the transformation. And then I might have to round up with the memoir with that
Yeah.
wonderful title.
And
But
he actually has another one. I think it's like a Saturday night at the Lakeside Supper Club. It literally just came out within the past month, which is why I didn't have a chance to read it before our show. But I think this will give you a good introduction to him. And these stories are they're very varied. So you could definitely read them back to back. Like you're not going to feel like you're reading the same thing.
right. Oh, wonderful. These are wonderful. Thank you.
Yay.
These seem perfect for me. And from what I know of my audience, perfect for them. And they just seem perfect for a beginning of summer season of reading.
Yeah. That's what I tried to
Well
stick with.
done. Well done. I love them.
Thank
But
you.
before we wrap up, I do want to ask you about what you're currently reading. I always love to ask people, my favorite question to ask, whether you're an adult, especially if you're a kid, because kids just love this question, is first, what are you reading lately? And number
Yeah.
two, what is that book stack of what you've been reading lately? If that book stack could talk, what would it say about you? So what's something you're reading lately and what kind of secrets does it reveal about you and your reading life?
Yeah. So I always have 3 books going at one time.
Oh my goodness,
So
that's a whole nother episode we could talk about. I am
I'll try to keep
a
it
book
brief.
lover.
Because here is how this works. So I'm a morning person. And so in the morning is when I try to pick up a book that is maybe personal development or a spiritual read, something that I really want to think and digest a little bit more. And so right now, that book for me happens to be How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And it's a classic. I can't believe I have not read it up
I
until now.
haven't either, but I certainly know of it and him. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm with
it
you
is
there.
so relevant, I think, whether I mean, unless you lived under a rock and you don't deal with people at all,
Right.
then it probably wouldn't be. But even me, even if you're not in the professional world, there's so much about interpersonal relationships. It's really made me think and reconsider those interactions, just even in my family, right?
Yeah.
Even in family life. And so it's been a really good one. My second book, so I have a morning stack downstairs. And then upstairs by my bed on my nightstand, I have a second stack. And that is my fiction based reads, the ones that I don't really, of course, I'm paying attention, but don't require the same amount of attention as my morning reads, right? It's a lighter story. It's I don't read much horror or thrillers, to be honest, just because I don't want it. The time I'm reading fiction is in the evening and I don't want it to keep me up at night. So again, this is another part of my show is I don't want to say I'm not a thriller reader, quote unquote, because I've really never explored the genre. So I actually had someone come on and talk about thrillers recently, and I'm willing to try that aren't so maybe scary, keep me up at night. But I am working my way in my fiction book stack through The Evening and the Morning by Ken Follett. Have you read any books by him?
I have not. This is brand.
Okay, so they're really epic books. I mean, they're like, I don't know. I don't think there's anything short of 750 pages by him.
Oh, okay. I appreciate that heads up.
Yeah. But he is what really introduced me to the field or the genre of historical fiction. And happens to be the prequel to his Kingsbridge series and the 4th book of the series. So the 3rd book of the trilogy, I guess, right? Outside of the prequel is coming out this fall, which is kind of why it spurred me, because I've read the first two books of the trilogy, but I've never read the prequel. I didn't even know there was a prequel until I started investigating it a little bit more. So I'm reading that in anticipation for this book coming out in the fall to be the third part of the, or
Oh,
actually, I'm sorry, it's the fourth part. So it's not going to be a trilogy anymore. But this new book coming out that'll be in this series. So
awesome.
that's the evening and the morning. It's set in like 900 England and like Normandy, France, and it's really about those eras. And you know, a 900-page book, you're really diving deep.
You are definitely diving deep there. So,
um,
in thinking about your stacks, if
yeah,
I were to say if your book stack could talk, what would it say? Right? It sounds like that you value personal growth, personal development, really learning, pushing the boundaries of your own self, and that kind of characterizes your morning reading. Do you love historical fiction? Are those the books that you lean
that
into?
would, yeah, that would for sure be my favorite genre. And I think when I know I love a book, right, when I really sit down to think about it, is a book that makes me think about, if I was faced with the same situation, time, circumstances of history, would I react the same? And
Yeah.
people that are inspirational, right? They stood their ground, right? Almost like, I mean, not maybe a true hero that's pushed out there, but that really made a difference. I think of my all-time favorite book is The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. Have you read that one?
I have not.
It's actually a true story, and it's a family that hid Jewish people during World War II in their home in Amsterdam. And it was their faith that had drove them to do that. They were a watchmaking family, and they just started hiding Jewish families in their home and ended up eventually being sent to the concentration camps themselves because they were caught. But that is like the epitome of a story that I love. If I was in 1942 Amsterdam during World War II and I knew Jewish people were being taken away, would I have the courage to stand up and do the same?
Yes. Oh,
So,
those are big questions. Those are big questions, but books give us the perfect opportunity to think about that because
yeah,
we literally live inside the pages with them, and you can't help but wonder or question
yeah,
your own actions that can then help us do better today with
yeah.
what we actually are facing.
And so what you're saying, I think about my stacks, I think that I like to, even though it's a fiction book, quote unquote, I like to read books where, again, it maybe pushes or makes me think about who I am as a person and how I would show up in that situation, which I think is also in the same vein of probably personal development
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, it's kind of a big overarching theme regardless of your stack or the time of day.
Yeah. Yeah. And then my last book, which is not a stack, a true stack, because it's audiobooks.
Okay.
And so those tend to come in. I put a lot of holds into the library for those. And so those tend to come in, when they're available. And so my Libby app really picks my next book for me that way, which makes it really easy. I don't have to think too hard about what I'm going to be reading next because it's just what hold comes in.
Right. Right.
And so with that one, I'm actually reading Happy Place by Emily Henry, which is
Yes.
like the perfect summer read right now. I'm so glad I got like a skip the line hold on it. And it couldn't have come at a better time because it feels like the perfect beach summer read.
Yeah, I just put together my own audiobook playlist because I am a terrible audiobook reader. I have a harder time focusing because I tend to multitask when I listen to
Yeah.
podcast or I'm listening to something, and I find that I've multitasked myself right out of the book and then have to, go back to it. So I don't tend to listen to books, but I'm trying this summer. I'm going to listen to memoirs narrated by the author. And
Yeah.
even though that's not the case here, Happy Place is on my audiobook list because I know I love the author. I know I
Yeah.
will be hooked in. And even if I multitask, I have a feeling I will still be present for
Yeah.
this particular book.
And I have found, I feel like I actually started audiobooks. So another place we lived in Hawaii, and I walked to work. And that was when I started getting into podcasts. I mean, this was like 2011. So I think they were just coming around as a thing, but I got into podcasts. And then I started getting into audiobooks that way because it was a little under a mile that I would walk to work, both ways. And I started at that point, I would listen to these nonfiction books because I'm like, I would always fall asleep reading the nonfiction books. So I'm like, maybe this is another way to read nonfiction and maybe I could actually get through them. But exactly what you're saying is I found very quickly that I couldn't pay attention well enough to them to really understand or digest the material I was reading. So I have found that these lighter reads like Happy Place, right? That don't require as much following along in the story. That is what I tend to read now on audiobooks.
Yeah. It reminds me in this, I hope I don't offend anyone when I say this, but I can leave, a soap opera for a couple of weeks and then watch one episode and pick right back up. So I think if I tune out for like a minute, I'll be okay on the audio.
Exactly, because you're probably were invested in enough of the story that you know the characters, you kind of know what they're about. So you're like, if you miss like that they fell asleep, reading a book,
right?
it's
We're
no big
still
deal.
Good. We're okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, well, it has been so much fun chatting with you. Not only do I have books set in the Midwest that can help me escape my neck of the woods this summer, but now I have some other books that you're reading and loving and some validation that my audio book list is on the right track too. So thank you for all of that.
You are so welcome.
How can listeners find you? Tell us where the best place to find you and Bookish Podcast or Bookish your podcast.
Yeah, so you could go directly to the website. It's bookishflights.com. And then you could get any of the links to the different podcast networks. So, Spotify, Apple, Google, iHeartRadio. I mean, the list goes on, right? It's on all the major platforms. You could just go to those and search Bookish Flights as well. But if you want to go to the website to make it easy, all the hyperlinks are on there. You could just click and pick your podcast platform of choice to listen. I'm also on Facebook and I'm also on Instagram. And that is also just at Bookish Flights. Really simple. And then I just created last week, actually, it's been on my mind for a while. I wanted to create this interactive place for people to come, like a Facebook group, more of a community, right? Where we can encourage consistency in reading. We can ask each other for book recommendations. And it's not so like, I'm just posting to tell you about the podcast episode. I really want this to be a community where we can come and chat all things books and reading. So I can send you the link for that, Stephanie, but it's called Build a Book Flight. And so it's because, again, it's going to be like you're choosing your own adventure, right? This isn't going to be me telling you what books we talked about on the show. I mean, maybe a little bit of that to get some conversation going, but it's really going to be the place for people to come and find their next great book. Or I know one of my questions is my husband is like, he's been really loving, he likes the thriller genre, but more like the Navy SEAL, CIA, FBI type. And he's looking for another series to read. So that's kind of one of my questions I want to take to the group and be like, have you guys read these? Do you have any, here's what he likes. What would you recommend? Because I don't know all the books.
Yeah. I love that. And I definitely want the link because I would love to hop for myself. I said earlier that book mail is the best mail. And I just think book people are the best people. So the more communities that we can get in to talk and share and connect and pay the next book forward, the better. So I will definitely link to your website, to your social media channels, and to this group in the show notes so that listeners can start binge listening to all of your Bookish Flights too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come on the show. This, like I said, was so fun to be on the other side of the mic and just kind of feel that pressure a little bit of what my guests feel when they come on the show. And it's been so fun to meet you and chat books. And I really hope that we stay in touch.
Oh, I do too. Yes. I will be touching base to let you know what I thought of your book recommendations. And then, if I ever do get over on my bucket list to visit that almonds and chocolate that you mentioned, I will be knocking on your email there too.
Yeah, it could be literally just be a travel for culinary adventures, which, as you could tell by my book flight, is probably how I live my life.
That's right. Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure today.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Get Literate podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes and at alitlife.com. And If you want more, you might like to join my Patreon community. There, you'll find additional inspiration for your reading and writing lives, like bonus podcast episodes, book calendars, monthly book clubs, notebooking challenges, live events, giveaways, and much more. It's only $5 a month, and you get instant access to all the previous content too. You can learn more at getliterate.co. But one more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish and no bookish community too. Thanks so much for listening.